Hello and welcome everyone to this TASA Thursday event, where we will be discussing the pros and cons and maybe do a little bit of myth busting about doing a traditional thesis versus a thesis by publication. And hopefully for all the early HDR colleagues out there who are grappling with this decision, you can get a little closer to making that choice. I'm Richa George, a member of the TASA Postgraduate Sub-Committee, and joining me to support me today is Dorinda Hart and Laura, who are also members of the TASA PG Sub-Committee. Before we go any further, let me acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land from where I speak, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations. I also pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge their living connection to country, relationship with their land, and all living things extending back tens of thousands of years. So today we have a panel discussion followed by an open Q&A. You're also welcome to put in all your questions in the chat. We can discuss them together with the panel. So just to give you a little background before we start, the most common approach to doing a PhD around the world is what we often refer to as a traditional approach, which involves constructing a single monograph that reports on the PhD study. In a lot of disciplines, countries, and universities, the traditional thesis still holds favor. But recently, the thesis by publication has emerged as a viable alternative where candidates publish their work throughout their candidature and include their research outputs in their final thesis submission. It's particularly popular in Europe, but in Australia, the TBP is not yet commonplace. And as such, there aren't very many guidelines about how to go about doing one, or even what the relative advantages and disadvantages are of each approach. So, to help us unpack this very important topic, we have three wonderful panelists. We've got Dr. Alice Campbell, a postdoctoral research fellow in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Children and Families over the life course of at the Institute of Social Science Research. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Queensland, for which she produced a traditional thesis, has published several articles, and now has a forthcoming book. Next, we have Claire Moran, who is very successfully on the last leg of her PhD journey at Monash University. Claire is doing a thesis by publication where she explores the social media experiences of African youth and their sense of belonging in Australia, and is a very vocal advocate of the TBP style of PhD and is here to share her experiences with us. Finally, our last panelist is Dr. Farida Fozdar, a sociologist and professor of anthropology and sociology at the University of Western Australia. She has published widely with over 100 journal articles, chapters, books, and reports. And more importantly for us right now, she has also supervised over 20 PhD students doing both the traditional thesis styles as well as the thesis including published works. Farida, please correct me if the number is not up to date. And she's here to share very critical supervisory perspective about supporting and assessing both styles of the PhD. So welcome the panel to this really important session, and welcome all of you. Well, let's hope it's a great session. Anyway, so I'm going to start with my first question, which is for Alice. Could you help unpack a traditional thesis? Tell us what a monograph is and talk about your experiences of doing a traditional thesis.
Okay, well, it's something I had to kind of learn as I went along. So I feel like for at least the first year, if not the first couple of years of doing my PhD, I would say to people, I still don't know what a PhD is. Like, no one actually tells you what a PhD is, what it's supposed to look like. There isn't a template. I mean, there kind of is, because you can go to the library and look at other people's theses, and that's what I ended up doing. And sort of over time, consulting other people's theses, I kind of built up a picture of what mine should maybe look like. But I kind of, my main point is I went in, sorry, a bit blind, just kind of stumbled along, found my way. And found myself doing the traditional thesis by default, I suppose. No one ever said to me, you know, do you want to do it this way or this way? It was just kind of, you know, this is how it's done. along the way, I did at some points, because I had some colleagues. So I did my PhD at UQ, but in the Institute for Social Science Research. So it's multidisciplinary. I have colleagues from public health backgrounds and whose supervisors are in public health, so or other disciplines. So especially in public health, that thesis by publication seems to be quite common. And I saw some of my colleagues doing thesis by publication. And there were definitely a few moments where I felt a bit resentful that I wasn't doing thesis by publication. I was like, why do I have to do this? It's like so much more work. I feel like I have to do so much more work. My thesis has 4 empirical chapters, and I did write those chapters pretty much in a way that they were very easily transformed into journal articles. So they've all been published now. So I do have 4 journal articles from my thesis. 2 of them were published before I submitted, and the other 2 have been published since. But there was still work involved in sort of like transforming this 10,000 word thesis chapter into a journal article. And then there was also the expectation of having this, like, you know, theoretical framework chapter and a data chapter and introduction and conclusion. And it just seemed like so much more work than what some other people seem to be doing. But having said that, I guess it all worked out really well for me. So I got my 4 publications from my thesis, and I also got a contract for a book. So I am due to submit that at the end of next month. And so maybe in hindsight, that is an advantage of doing the traditional thesis, is that I have, you know, 4 journal papers, plus I can actually also get a book out of it, because there is a lot of extra stuff like the theoretical framework stuff that, you know, wasn't really in any of the journal articles to the same extent. So yeah, I guess, yeah, that's been my experience. So I did resent it a bit at the time. I thought it seemed like a lot of extra work, but I guess it worked out okay for me in the end.
So could you tell us a little bit about the possibilities offered by when you have your monograph, how easy it is, or the amount of work that goes in when you're converting your thesis into your first book? Like I'm fairly certain that once you've finished your PhD, there's a certain amount of PhD fatigue that goes in, and then going back and taking a look at that, I don't know, 100,000 word thesis and trying to convert that into a book, that must have been daunting, but it's also a possibility that's there, right? It's an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I haven't finished that process, and of course I've left it to the last minute. So that's pretty much what I'm doing the next 2 months. So I can't really tell you how much work goes into it. No, again, it's something I feel completely clueless about. So my advisors were both like, you know, yeah, you should publish this as a book. And again, I was like, but I don't even know how to do that. What does that involve? What does that mean? Do I have to completely rewrite it? Is this? And so I still feel quite clueless about it, but in my limited experience, so I just went out and just kind of looked at a few different publishers and then what they asked for in terms of like submitting a proposal to them. And they all ask for different things. So for example, one of the publishers I looked at was New York University Press, because my PhD thesis was on women's sexual identities, and they publish a lot on that topic and some books that I really like. So they were one of the publishers I kind of reached out to, but they wanted, like, I think it was like at least 3 sample chapters and this and that. And I felt like I would have to maybe do a lot of work just to get a contract, a book contract. But then other publishers, so I ended up signing a contract with Palgrave, but also Routledge was another one, and they both expected a lot less. So the proposal was something very easy to put together based on, you know, what you already have from your thesis. Now, in terms of like how much work do I have to do to then transform my thesis into a book? Well, I gave myself extra work because I actually proposed an additional chapter in the book that isn't in my thesis. It was something I'd wanted to do in my thesis and I hadn't been able to. My advisor, who's now my boss, well, one of my advisors, who's now my boss, she's always like, oh, you know, you should just have given them your thesis. Like, that's what I did 30 years ago, you know, don't make extra work for yourself. But, you know, I had proposed this extra chapter and now I feel like I have to deliver that. So that's probably most of the work. I feel like the thesis doesn't need a lot of work to be submitted as a manuscript, as a book, just tiny little tweaking and that sort of thing. But you need to get permissions for if you've published chapters as journal articles, but that's also super straightforward. Most journals, if you are putting the paper into a book that you're the sole author of, it's an automatic approval. So yeah.
Well, that's a very helpful tip, because I would have assumed that that would have been a big barrier to creating the book, is because you've already got published journal articles out there.
It doesn't seem to be.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Thanks, Alice. So I'm going to quickly jump over to Claire and ask you about, first of all, could you start off by giving us a broad definition of what your experience of the TBP model, and then yes, tell us more about what it's been like.
Sorry, yes, absolutely, with pleasure. And I think just sort of jumping off what Alice said, I think being clueless in those first couple of months, no matter what thesis format you choose, is so normal. And I wish, earlier on in my candidature, I had have had a session like this, because I really struggled at the beginning to find really good examples of thesis by publication that I could kind of look to get a sense of what the expectation was. And it's only been kind of in the last few years that I've kind of networked with the right people and found the right resources, which, I'm really happy to share with you today. I actually sent you a few links just before, Richa, if you want to share those with everyone who's here today. But yeah, I really struggled at the start to kind of wrap my head around what a thesis by publication was. And there are so many different ways of doing it that I've seen. So really broadly, a thesis by publication is a format of a thesis that generally includes articles that have been published or submitted during your candidature. And it really varies by institution, and even within Monash University, it varies by discipline. And it's really vague. Like the Faculty of Arts thesis by publication at Monash Uni, there's no minimum amount of publications required. They can be under review. They don't have to have formally been accepted. And there's not even like a word count, that you have. They sort of have, maximum 80,000 words for a thesis, and that's, the standard thesis, and that's kind of what we're looking to at the moment as I go through the final stages of finishing mine. So it's a super vague format, and I think that speaks back to it's still a really emerging kind of format, I think, for a thesis. It seems to be more popular in certain disciplines, like I've seen a lot in education, for example, but in sociology, I think I've seen maybe 3 or 4 at this point. So it's definitely one of those ones where I first started and I was really like, okay, what is this going to look like and what does it mean? But at the same time, it was suggested to me early. I come from a bit of a weird kind of route to become a PhD student. I did a undergrad, many years ago, and said, that's it for university for me, never again. And then a few years later, I came back and did my master's, and I was like, yep, that's done. And then I was like, oh, you know what, I want to be an academic. And I was really interested in being an academic. So I thought, okay, let's do a PhD. And but because of that, I'd never researched before. I wasn't an honors student. I had no background in research. I had no publications. And that made me really not competitive at all for scholarships. And so my supervisor, Brady Robards, who's my primary supervisor, he said to me, you've got to get some publications out to be more competitive for those scholarships. You might want to think about not only, taking on some RA work to get your name on some publications, but also thinking about publishing early your research to try and become more competitive for your scholarship. So it was kind of floated to me earlier with that in mind. And then it just made sense the more I did that it was the format that I really kind of felt excited by. I publish, I write, I research in an area that there's like a huge gap of knowledge. There's not a lot of people doing what I'm doing. I look at social media experiences of African young people in Australia, and like no one's in this area. There's nothing. So I was really kind of passionate about putting out my research early, because social media research as well, it changes so much. And it becomes kind of old really quickly. So I really wanted this kind of timely publication of my research, but also I really wanted to start contributing to the field and kind of advancing the research within this large gap that I'm working in. So I really felt kind of passionate about that part of it as well. I didn't really want to wait till the end to then like write, kind of transfer, the thesis into an article. I really wanted to be doing it as I was going. And it just really made sense to me early on that that was kind of the approach that I wanted to take. I think as well, the idea of writing a book, like a full thesis, was really overwhelming for me. I'm someone who works really well in kind of like small incremental steps. And so in my mind, doing like little publications, I just felt like much more excited and much more comfortable about that, rather than, I know you could like, it's chapters, right? But it felt like the book felt like a really big undertaking. Whereas, yeah, the little papers and the collaborations on those papers, I write with other people. I'm primary author and I do the bulk of the work. It's like 80% me. But I've been able to collaborate with other authors as I go, and they've not only pushed me and advanced my work and you know, really shaped the research in their own way, but it's been more of a collaborative project as well as I've gone. I haven't felt super isolated. I haven't felt kind of, you know, this mountain of work in front of me like I think the thesis felt like that at the start, and I haven't had that as I've gone. Not to say that that's the experience of everyone who does the traditional thesis, but in my mind, that's kind of the thought process that was going on when I kind of went towards the thesis by publication.
Great. I think as someone, including myself, and for other students who, I mean, for other HDR candidates who are on this seminar and trying to understand, I think I've got very practical questions from someone who absolutely has no idea, because I'm still grappling with this choice. So I was very excited about this topic. So I think my questions are, well, when, even like what Alice said that there was no other option offered to her. My supervisor, who also happens to be Brady, offered this choice to me from the beginning, and we've been kind of debating this. And I think it comes down to how late and how soon into your PhD journey can you afford to make this decision? And also in terms of like, how soon did you start publishing into your candidature? And what's the routine like? Say, I don't know if there's a guideline in terms of, like you said, you can have either 3 papers or 4 papers. Does it need to be sole authored? So just like a few practical questions like that. I think Claire's a little frozen. Okay, so what we can do is we can come back to Claire. My next question is for Dr. Farida. And as someone who is supporting students who are doing both kinds of theses and also assessing and examining them, what is, you know, the critical perspective that we don't have, which is the supervisor's perspective? Could you give us some about both these approaches?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm coming to you from Wajak Noongar land over here in Western Australia, and I see that one of my PhD students by publication, Bernardo Dewey, is online as well. So hey Bernardo, please don't criticise or contradict anything I'm saying. So I want to talk about sort of some of the pros and cons from the perspective of the supervisor and perhaps also the examiner. And a lot of the points have already been raised, so I'll just kind of touch on them, less or more depending on whether they've been covered. And the first is related to Richa's question just now, which is what is the actual format like? And this is, my experience has been that there are very many different policies depending on which university you're at. So you have to see what your own university's policy is. So I was at Murdoch, and at Murdoch they were very clear that it had to be a minimum of 3 or 4 papers, something like that, and that they had to be at least accepted for publication. Whereas at UWA, the policy is very, very broad. And so we've sort of started using the term thesis as a series of papers, because at UWA it doesn't require them to be published. It just says that, you know, you can have some of the papers, some parts of the thesis can be formatted as papers. So there's this really wide range of expectations. The experience that I've had with students has been that, that at least some of the papers preferably a majority of the papers, are actually published and the others accepted for publication. So yeah, okay, so briefly just to go through sort of pros and cons. Obvious pros of thesis by publication is that you've got publications going as you're completing your PhD, which sets you up competitively with an advantage against others in job applications and applications for postdocs, DECRAs, etc. So that's the obvious one. The development of the skills of the craft of publishing is also something that is one of the benefits. So it usually works like an apprenticeship where you're working much more closely in terms of the writing with the supervisor. So often, because the supervisor may also be getting their name on the paper, they will contribute more than they would, in terms of the crafting of the writing of your chapters, if a thesis. As Claire mentioned, it kind of is easier for some students because you've got these sort of bite-sized chunks that you're focusing on. Okay, I'm writing my literature review now. You can do that as a chapter for a traditional thesis. But if you think about it in terms of writing it as a potential publication, that makes it kind of doable as a bite-sized chunk. You perhaps have a slightly different sort of sense of who the audience might be for it, etc. And then you think about the rest of the thesis as, okay, how should this bit be crafted as a chapter? How should this bit be crafted as a chapter? And that can make it kind of easier to manage. The relationship with the supervisor is slightly different. This relates back to what I was saying about the craft of publishing. It's sort of more collegial. You become kind of partners in the development of the work. And towards the other end, when you come to examination, it would be almost impossible for an examiner to fail a thesis where some of the papers within it have been published. So it gives you that advantage at the other end as well. Also, if your thesis, we're talking as though everybody gets their thesis published as a book. This is not necessarily the case, particularly if you've got quite a niche kind of thesis topic. It can be perhaps sometimes easier to get some of it published as papers. So those are the pros. The cons are, and these are things that I don't think students necessarily kind of recognise at the start, and even supervisors. The length of time is extended. So think of the amount of time needed to, first of all, craft your first paper and then send that off for review. And then you get the reviewers' responses back. You then have to modify the paper, etc. Then when it's eventually accepted, if it is, it then takes some time to publication as well. Multiply that by 4 at a minimum, and that's the length of time that your thesis kind of gets extended. So that's a definite con. The other one is, and I've got a number here, but these are 2 important ones that I think need to be taken into consideration. You are held to a much higher standard for publications than you are for a thesis. So when we're looking for examiners for theses, we think about, who's going to be a kind of sympathetic examiner, and any examiner knows that they're examining a thesis, and so they're kind of generous and they're trying to work out ways in which they can get you through. You send a paper off, they have no idea that you're a student, a freshie kind of trying to get your first publication. They're looking for reasons to assist the journal by rejecting the paper, right? So the papers, your writing, your conceptualization, even the veracity of the method, etc., need to be even stronger to get it through the publication process. So I think that's and then the other, I guess, a related issue around that is that the tendency might be to try lower level journals, but that then may not be as useful to you in terms of your CV, etc. So to me, because of that standard issue, the higher level of quality required, I'm very careful in accepting students to do thesis by publication. I think only the best students should be doing thesis by publication. publication. Then there are issues in terms of cons, issues around structure. How do you write this thing so that you've got enough of a methods chapter? And usually what students do is you'll have some methods in each of your publications, but then you might also add a much more extensive chapter, which is a methods chapter, which goes into kind of the theory of methods, sort of methodology, etc. Has a much more extended ethics section, an extended section about the actual experience of and kind of reflective reflections on the experience of the method, etc. So that becomes kind of an extra chapter, more extended. There can be issues with kind of repetition, because you might repeat some of your method, definitely, your lit review, potentially, in some of the papers and so on. So you really are relying on the examiner to kind of understand what you're doing here, and recognise that need for repetition. There's also relatedly an issue around word length, that if you think 4 or 5 papers, and the papers are usually 8,000 words, you've then got an extra 40 to 50,000 words that you need to find from somewhere. And you can do an introduction, that extended methods, and possibly extended lit review, and the conclusion, but it can be a bit of a challenge to work out how to make up those extra words. Then finally, sorry, just a couple more points. Some examiners, because this is relatively new here, some examiners kind of don't know what a thesis by publication is. So yeah, as a new method, you need to ensure that your supervisor, when selecting the examiners, lets them know what this structure is about. Whether you can subsequently turn your publications into a monograph is another question. It was interesting to hear the experience. I think it was Claire that was talking about. No, it was Alice actually who was talking about that it's okay to publish as a book, even if some of it has already been published as papers. Then there's sort of questions around authorship as well, and yeah, how it can be crafted to be a kind of a single text rather than chunks as papers are. Okay, and then yeah, questions around authorship and whether the supervisors become authors on all the papers, or do they negotiate that a couple of the papers are appear just in the student's name. It can be of benefit for the student to have papers in their own name. It can also be a benefit to them to have if their supervisor is a well-known researcher, that can be a benefit as well. So that's just a matter of negotiation. It's not really a pro and con, but something that needs to be thought about. So that's a few bits and pieces from the supervisor's perspective.
That was a very, very comprehensive pros and cons list, and I think we need to publish that as a guideline. that was amazing. Thank you, Farida. And just piggybacking off of what you said and what Claire said, I think I did a fair amount of research trying to understand how practical this method is. And yes, the issue of repetition is a huge one, and trying to negotiate that in your final thesis. As someone, and this is probably entirely anecdotal, when you're starting off a PhD, you're always starting off doing something. And I feel like 1 year down the lane, you're doing something completely different. And then half a year later, you've changed your epistemology, you've changed your method. How difficult is it to account for changes to your methodology or changes to the rationale, etc., when you've already published and you're trying to then include that in your final thesis?
Is that a question for anyone in particular?
I mean, I would, either of you, if either any of you would like to go, that would be great. Yes.
So I think what is most important is the narrative. It's useful to know the history of thesis by publication. So thesis by publication was originally brought in because universities kind of changed the sort of requirement that all staff had to have PhDs, and there were staff that didn't have PhDs, but they had lots of publications. So the PhD by publication initially was about it was a means of allowing those staff to craft some of their existing publications, kind of bundle them all together, put an introduction and a conclusion together, and submit that as a PhD. So those papers may not have been necessarily as closely related to each other as what we do now in terms of the thesis by publication. The most important thing is the narrative that you manage to and I've seen some theses by publication where, as well as the introduction that explains what the logic is in terms of the connection between the papers, etc. Also having a sort of an introduction to each of the papers as well that says, this is what I'm doing in this paper. And so as long as you do that, and that then, if the thesis has changed to some extent, you add that to the narrative. And we all know that the trajectory of research is not linear. So it's about kind of acknowledging that and demonstrating the ways in which you've creatively managed that process.
It's so funny hearing you say that, Farida, because I very early on in my candidature, Brady, who's my primary supervisor, he was kind of, the optimist around, the PhD by publication. And I have a supervisor, Helen Forbes-Mewett, who's an amazing supervisor. And she explained to me exactly what you just said to me, and then said that she didn't want me to do a PhD by publication for those reasons. And it was a really interesting one because I'd never considered that before. And in her mind, it was kind of like almost kind of like a cheating way of doing a thesis, because that's what had happened at the start of that format being introduced. But then what happened, so she said, do whatever you like, but this is obviously, my perspective on it. And then I got to my mid-candidature milestone, which is at Monash. It's kind of like your halfway point. You kind of present your whole thesis, what you want to do, how it's all going to work out. And then you submit kind of a couple chapters. And she read that document and she said to me, Claire, I can see the narrative of the thesis now and I see how it's going to work, and you've convinced me. And I went, yes, Helen's on board, because at the start she was, really skeptical about how it was going to work. And so that narrative of the thesis, working out how everything ties together, is essential. You have to present a coherent body of work with a thesis by publication. It has to make sense to the reader. It has to have a clear story to it, and it has to tie together, even though it is disjointed at times. And so thinking about that really clearly, and I would say I knew from early stages of data collection, my thesis started to take shape in my mind. I knew really what the key empirical findings were, and I knew what the theoretical findings were, and I knew kind of how that was going to unfold within the thesis. And then it was just a process of, the last couple of months I've been writing my forewords and my afterwords, or my bridging chapters, as Brady and I like to call them, to basically situate each of the papers within that narrative of the thesis, and to kind of keep bringing each of those papers back to, okay, this is where we are, and this is how that paper contributes, and then this paper is going to build on that paper by then continuing that narrative, and then having a really good either integrated discussion or a really strong kind of conclusion. Other people call them kind of like either integrated discussion or like paper kind of discussion or overarching discussion. There's lots of different ways that people kind of come back to that, but it's essentially how did all these things connect, and working out that either that's a chapter, or it's a bridging chapter, or it's a foreword, or it's an introduction, it's a conclusion, however you want to situate it within your paper, but making sure that that's really strong throughout the thesis is, I think, what I've learned to be a really kind of core part of this format.
I think we can write that down as a tip, is basically to focus on the narrative and make everything seem coherent. I think we can all agree that there is increasing pressure on PhD students to publish during your candidature at this point, and this applies to everyone. So this, whether you're doing a TBP where you have a lot more possibilities to publish. My question to Alice is, as students, as PhD candidates, when publications is basically our currency, how practical is it, or how, I keep using the word easy, which I think is very wrong, but then how was it publishing along the journey when having journal articles or publishing wasn't a submission requirement, a thesis submission requirement?
I don't think has to be hard. And I mean, I guess I was super motivated to do it because I knew how important it was, but also because for me, if I'm doing research, I'm not just, I mean, I enjoy it, so I'm doing it for my own benefit, but I don't just want to be the only person who knows about it. So it's like, I want to communicate it. So, and I think that's, I actually really strongly recommend that students should try to publish even if they're doing a traditional PhD thesis, because I found that experience was so beneficial to shaping my research going forward. So when you submit a paper and you get those reviews, it can really like shape your thinking, and you learn so much from getting those reviews. So that then shapes you going forward working on the next chapter. So I definitely highly recommend. I think you just have to prioritize it. So once you've got that first empirical chapter, I mean, I guess I don't know if everyone writes their PhD thesis the same way that I did, but definitely the way I did it was in, 4 empirical chapters that could all be papers. And so when I had that first empirical chapter, while there was pressure, of course, like your advisors are like, and sometimes my advisors were like, oh, just get on with the next chapter. But, I was like, no, it's really important to submit. And so, yeah, as soon as you've got that first empirical chapter, just prioritizing, turning it into a paper, hopefully with as little work as possible. Hopefully you've written it in a way that it's very easily transformed into a paper, and submitting it. And because once you've submitted it, you might not hear anything for a few months. So then you move on to the next chapter, and then you get feedback, and you might have to spend a couple of weeks like really focusing on the revisions. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely doable. And I think it's really beneficial and really important to do.
Great. So in that case, what I'd like to ask right now is, for all the listeners here, and especially me, what tips would each of you have in terms of to decide what method basically suits us best? How could we decide as PhD candidates or early HDR students? Because I'm 1.5 years into my PhD myself, and I'm still grappling with this decision. I still haven't decided which one I want to do, and it really is a matter of fit as much as it is about the pros and cons as well. So, what tips would you have?
I don't know if I personally have tips, because I have only done it the one way. So I feel like I don't really know what it would have been like if I'd done it another way. I think, in some way, maybe don't overstress it. Like if you don't have a strong feeling either way, then maybe go with what, your advisor is suggesting and most supportive of. And just, you can still prioritize publishing whichever way you do it. So I guess, maybe don't overthink it if you don't have a strong feeling either way.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah, I think as well, your supervision team is really key to making this decision. If your supervisors don't really know much about the format, they've never supervised a thesis by publication before, they're not really sure. I mean, your supervisor is really key in kind of helping you to, particularly at the final stages, really put it all together and make it a convincing thesis to be examined. So I would say if you've got a supervision team that doesn't really seem on board with it, that might be a bit of a hurdle to kind of work out. Because I've had kind of a lot of hand holding the whole way through. And if I hadn't have had that, I think it would have been a really tough process. So yeah, I think your supervision team, I think it's also really important to think about what your research is. I knew very early on what the narrative of my thesis would be, and I knew very early on what my chapters or my papers would look like. And so because I had that very clearly, I mean, I've had a very smooth sailing PhD. That doesn't happen to a lot of people. I'm really grateful for the experience I've had, but I knew very early on what it was going to look like. And now, I've got 6 publications, one that's still kind of pending. So I wrote early, I had that idea really early. And so for me, it just kind of, it made sense. But if you're not kind of seeing maybe a cohesive kind of contribution, and you're 2 years in, or you're starting to really feel the pressure, that maybe just writing and going that traditional way is maybe a little bit less pressure, because as Farida was saying earlier, you've got to submit your writing relatively early because you're waiting for that peer review process. So maybe therefore going that the original kind of monograph way is the better option. But I think it's something you'll have to ask yourself as you go forward.
Thanks, Claire.
I would just add, I totally agree. The other thing to think about is that the first thesis I supervised was actually a PhD that was part of my future fellowship, and as part of the application, I had identified that it would be a thesis by publication, and it very obviously chunked into separate publication. So I think this is sort of one of the questions to ask yourself. Does your thesis and your research question or questions, are they going to do, and the methods that you use, are they likely to generate discrete kind of bite-sized chunks of information and argument that will suit being published as a series of papers? Or is it much more, kind of an argument that builds and needs 100,000 words in order to get to the point that you want to get to at the end? So the first one that I supervised, it was again sort of topics around Australian and transnational and post-national cosmopolitan kind of identities, but the same question was applied to a number of different data sources. So existing data sources such as online materials or sort of an analyses of responses to a government review of something, etc. And so these were obviously kind of discrete and therefore lent themselves well to thesis by publication. Whereas yeah, as I said, the other thesis questions and methods might not work so well as publications.
That's fantastic. I think at the minimum, a lot of people have an idea about what their topic is like, and you've given us a lot of food for thought in terms of thinking about our topic and the themes that come in and whether we can put them into discrete chunks. So I'm aware that we're about 15 minutes out, and I want to open it up we have a fair number of questions, and I know that Bernardo raised his hand. So I'll just quickly get to Bernardo and then I'll go to the rest of the questions.
All right, thank you, Richa. I just wanted to add something as a student and as someone that is writing the thesis as a series of paper in terms of tips for those that are thinking or trying to decide what to do. I have a bit of an interesting story because when I first started my PhD, I had a meeting with my two supervisors, like single meetings with each of them. And one of my supervisors went like, oh, you definitely need to write your thesis as a series of papers. And then when I had another meeting with the other supervisor, she went like, oh, your thesis is going to be a book. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I had two different perspectives, completely different. And both were like, yes, you have to do this. This is the best for you. So I think that a great advice for those that are deciding is first, of course, as we see here, there are not good or bad, but it's more about your pathway. What do you want to get out of this? I mean, as Claire was saying before, you needed publications. And in my position, I wanted to learn how to publish. I was thinking I cannot get out of this PhD without publishing articles. I just wanted to be able to publish an article and learn how to do it. So I think it has to do with the strategy that we all want to design as part of this pathway, and based on that, like decide whether you want to go that way and then the other one. But of course, considering also what Farida and Claire was saying about the narrative, because if you might want to do a PhD by publication, but if you don't have the schema, the structure of a thesis that will let you do that, you will get very frustrated because when you have to manage time with the publication, put everything together, it's like playing Lego. You need to put one publication, link into another one, and have a whole conversation all across the thesis. And it's really difficult. So that's another thing to consider, right? But yeah, so just a bit of my story and some tips for you to consider.
Thank you, Bernardo. That was a fantastic perspective. Okay, so I'm just going to go over to the chat right now, and we've got Mavis who's saying that she's doing a traditional PhD and she doesn't currently have an article, or she currently has an article for publication, but she's not sure if she can continue with a traditional PhD and still publish along the way. She's worried that the PhD by publication will put pressure on me to publish, whether I'm not ready but want to publish though. I think she's basically talking about the timing in terms of, yeah. So, well, even Farida, you were talking about how the timelines are very difficult when it comes to publishing by TBP, right? So, especially when the Australian perspective, where if you've got scholarship and the traditional RTP scholarship only gives you a time between 3 and 4 years. So I think there's definitely this question about being able to publish and get put that pressure to get your publication sorted out in that particular period of time. So I think the question is, maybe it differs from university to university, but do you have to have publications reviewed and come back accepted in order to do this, to do the TBP?
So yeah, look at the requirements of your own university. But the short answer to Mavis's question, that she's not sure if she can continue with traditional PhD and still publish along the way, yes, you can. So you submit it as a traditional PhD, and you say where you come to the chapter or two that are based on something that's already been published, you simply have a footnote that says the majority of this chapter has been published as a paper in such and such a thing, and that's another way to ensure that you don't fail your PhD. So, and that's actually, one of my papers was published, and that was back in the late 1990s. I'd published something, and that was a chapter in my thesis, and I just had it as a footnote, and that's more or less how things were done before thesis by publication became a thing.
There's definitely an interesting question as well here about what happens if you draft a paper and then can't get it published. I think that's everyone's fear. So I'm not sure, Sarah, if it's in terms of doing is it a thesis by publication in that perspective that it would be difficult, or whether if it's while you're doing a traditional thesis and not getting it done. Also, Eileen has raised her hand. Eileen, you can go ahead with the question while Sarah just, if you're doing a TBP. Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Richa. I was responding to that previous question about if you've submitted something and the first place you send it to has not accepted it. I think that's something that you're going to have to learn throughout your academic career, that you need to be pretty lucky every time that what you submit gets taken by the first person or the first journal. So somebody told me a while ago, always have at least 2 journals in mind. If the first one doesn't want it, try the second, and then try the third. Each time take on board if they send you comments or criticisms from referees, and just keep trying. It's a matter of finding the right niche for what you're working on.
Thank you, Eileen. So Claire's given us some links that we can all use, which is great. Thank you, Claire. I think in the end, we can conclude that both the thesis by publication and the traditional thesis, both of them come with considerable benefits and considerable as well as challenges. Something to be said about TBP is that you're publishing throughout your candidature, you're building that publishing portfolio, you get external evaluation while you're, early on throughout your PhD journey, which you might not do if you're doing a traditional thesis and not managing to publish at the same time. That could be, I'm sure, a double-edged sword as well, because it could be helpful to build that resilience, but it could also be distressing if you put in a lot of papers and, if you've drafted a paper and then that doesn't get accepted. But I guess in the end, pick one that suits you, pick one that suits your topic. Think about your narrative, and I guess, yes, it also depends on the kind of nature that you have, like whether you want to do it in small chunks, whether you're much more comfortable not dealing with the pressure of publishing through the journey and write your thesis, maybe it's more cohesive that way, and do the publishing on the side on your own time. There's also the advantage of being able to convert your thesis to a monograph. Not everybody does it. Not every topic is aligned with that particular goal. Yeah, that sounds great. Is there anything that any of our panelists might want to add that I haven't covered, that anytime in terms of tips or anything that anybody might want to add?
I think I dropped out of my internet when you were asking me a question, and I think when I came back in, Farida had given like a really good overview of some of the disadvantages or limitations of the thesis by publication. and you literally like ticked off my list as you went through. I think one of the only ones I wanted to emphasize, which I don't know if you covered, was I found just in the thesis by publication format, sometimes the level of depth that you can achieve in your analysis is limited. I think, as Farida was saying, you've got, like an 8,000 word journal article. Once you take out your abstract and your intro, your methods, and all of that's relatively repetitive, you maybe got like 3,000 to 4,000 words of analysis, and I'm finishing now, and I'm finishing alongside some of my peers who've done the traditional thesis. And I sometimes look at their findings chapters, and there's such rich depth to the data, and I feel a little bit like, oh, damn it, because there was so much more that I have in my data that I haven't really been able to kind of explore because I've done the thesis by publication. And so there is that kind of like, like that self-critique where I'm like, oh, there is just a bit of a lack of depth, in what I've been able to do within the format that I've chosen. And so there is that disadvantage to it as well. And I think really that depends again on your methods and, the research questions that you're asking. But I have noticed that now at the end that I have a lot more that I wanted to do, and maybe it's a postdoc or something, but definitely a limitation to consider as you go forward as well.
And that's why some supervisors don't want their students to do, they feel that the traditional method is the one that allows you to really develop your understanding and to advance knowledge kind of more broadly in a particular area. So that's, some supervisors have that as sort of their own kind of personal policy, that they won't let students do it exactly because of that.
Sounds like you've got a book in you, Claire, next. Expand on everything you've already done, add more.
And Alice, you spoke about having 4 empirical chapters, and did you do that? Was that the design of the book of the thesis from the beginning, or did you keep that in mind? Did you keep in mind that you wanted the journal articles out of it when you put it that way?
Yeah, I guess not really knowing what a thesis was. Like I knew better what a journal article was than what a thesis was. So it made more sense to me to just think of my thesis as journal articles. So maybe in that sense, I'm not the best example of a traditional thesis. And because my research was, analyses of secondary data, it's quant, I think it is quite different. Like if you were doing, maybe if your PhD was based on an ethnography or something, it might be different. But for me, it was very easy to sort of have, 4 sort of research questions that I was going to answer with this one data set that all kind of built on each other and made sense as 4 chapters. And that was pretty much the structure by confirmation. So like end of the first year, that was the structure of the thesis. And yeah, so that definitely made it, I think, easier to publish from the thesis as I went along. Yeah.
Thanks. I think I've missed a couple of questions. Lucinda had her hand up. Lucinda, do you want to go ask a question?
Yes, I found it very interesting. I'm coming here today from Yorta country, by the way, in Shepparton, Victoria. I've found it very interesting to hear what everyone's had to say. Thank you. That's a wonderfully rich panel. It has made me think, one of the things that comes through about Claire and Alice's supervision experiences is they've obviously enjoyed very good relationships with their supervisors. And I found it interesting to hear Farida talk about the idea that you're working closely with the supervisors and contributing to the crafting of the articles if you're doing thesis by publication or with publication, as we call it at La Trobe, and that the relationships are more collegial. And I can imagine, in fact, I know of instances where if those relationships aren't working well, that it can become very fraught. Now, I'm not wanting to be negative because I think it's a very positive experience in the way in which Alice and Claire are talking. But I think if the relationships aren't that close or collegial, and this might be an important tip perhaps about how well to get on with your supervisor, I think it can mean that students doing thesis, postgraduates by thesis by publication, could end up not really feeling they've had a chance to find their academic voice, that it's become complicated because there's been compromises having to be made with working in a collegial way with one supervisor. I just think, unfortunately, Claire's obviously not had that situation. And Alice has enjoyed very good relationships with her supervisors too. So I just, unfortunately, that's not always a given, but it seems to me where it is, obviously, thesis by publication could work very well. So just an observation there. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's also a question by Carly right at the beginning, which again I missed, which was about when you're collaborating with other authors on the papers, can you then claim that paper as your original work? Or is it okay as long as you're first author and have done most of the work and thinking on that particular topic? Can you then claim that as your original work?
Most of the thesis by publication that I've seen, you have to. There's some form that you have to include that actually articulates the percentage contribution for each of the papers. And so in that, you give a percentage and you actually explain briefly the contribution that the student has made and the contribution that the supervisor has made, etc. It's not a problem in terms of the question of whether you then are able to be granted a PhD. It's understood that there will be a collaborative relationship there, usually a closer collaborative relationship than traditional thesis.
And at U2, actually, they brought in oral examination as a requirement if you did thesis by publication, I think partly for that reason, so that, you know, they could sort of assess that you did actually do the bulk of this work, that this wasn't just a paper that your supervisor had done and you tacked your name on or something. But I think they've extended it now so that everyone has to do oral examination anyway, which makes sense.
So that's another good tip, which is find out what the institutional guidelines is about doing both styles in your particular university, because definitely there's a lot of variation across universities in Australia. There isn't a standardized model. So that's a good tip as well. I think we can keep this discussion going for a lot longer because there's so much to be said, but I'm aware we are at time. And because of that, I'm going to conclude today's session. It was really great to have you, Alice, Claire, and Farida join us and give us so much practical information about doing all different kinds of thesis styles and publishing along the way, etc. It was a great session, and I hope everyone who joined in today got a little bit more information. I definitely did. So thank you so much. And please if you do have any questions and weren't able to go through, put it across today, please feel free to email me or use the Twitter handle to send in any questions. I will pass them over to the panel. Or you can get in touch with them yourselves. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. It's been a great session, and have a great Thursday.